Babylon makes the rules. This is Dr. Negus, Rudis and Imhotep, coming your way with enough information throughout creation. Hello, everybody out there in the media world. We're here for another episode of Babylon Makes the Rules. Our topic today is the economics of reparations. You notice I've been talking about reparations for a couple of weeks, and I want to remain focused on that because it's needful. I have an article here written by Dr. William Darity Jr., a tenured professor at Duke University, who has over 398 publications and over 8,000 citations just from some of his works in the academic world. And we also have Dana V. Francis, PhD from the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And this article I'm going to read to you today, it's a peer review article, and we're going to talk about it here in a minute. The title of the article is, and the title of our subject today is The Economics of Reparations. This was an article written back in 2003, but yes, it's still timely. This article was written because there was the political, economy of ending racism, and the World Conference Against Racism came together to speak on this topic. So here we go. Reparations and slavery. The United States government postures at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, where the transatlantic slave trade was declared a crime against humanity, evading the warranted claim by African Americans for compensation for the enslavement of their ancestors. This evasive posture is deviated in light of the U.S. government's support for and the administration of reparations of other groups of subjects to recent history and grievous wrongs. Indeed, the United States has undertaken numerous reparation payments to Native American tribes for their atrocities and treaty violations. Two examples include the 1971 grant for $1 billion and the 44 million acres of land to Alaska Natives. And in 1986, grants of $32 million to the Ottawa tribe of Michigan. In addition, in 1990, the U.S. government issued a formal apology to the Japanese Americans subject to the internment during World War II and made a $20,000 payment to each of the 60,000 individual victims. In a non-USA precedent, the 1952 German Weidegard established groups-based identifications for Jewish people worldwide in the aftermath of Nazi persecution. Compensation included payment of more than $800 million to the state of Israel on behalf of 500,000 victims of the Nazis who was found refugees and bound refugees in their borders. And the Conference on Jews material claims against Germany on behalf of the victims of Nazi persecution who had immigrated to countries other than Israel. Thus, German reparation payments went to institutional entities, Israel and the Claims Conference, to survivors of the Holocaust who could reasonably establish specific harms or losses. Properties were confiscated, or anything of value that the people had was lost. And to relatives of those who were killed in the concentration camps, they received reparations. Similar principles govern the much later payment of $25 million by the Australian government in 1990 to Jewish claimants. Close to 250 years of domestic practices of enslavement of African people and their descendants has not elicited a similar response from the U.S. government. The paradox has not been lost, according to Wesley. Blacks have neither received any group compensation for the crime of slavery imposed upon them by the people and government of the United States. It said, let me restate that again. Blacks have never received any group compensation for the crime of slavery imposed upon them by the people and the government of the United States. As in the case of the Japanese and Jews, they received not only material compensation for their losses, but their victimization was also publicly memorialized in Germany and Israel and memorialized in the United States. Even though there was no legitimate claim of oppression or genocide that Jewish survivors of the Holocaust might assert against the United States, the only memorial dedicated to the suffering of black slaves and the survivors of slavery in the United States is contained in a series of legislation passed after the Civil War. The history of black Reconstruction shows how these enactments were successfully perverted by the courts and by Congress itself. Jim Crow overlooked. The World Conference Against Racism nearly exclusively focused on slavery and the slave trade, neglecting another compelling pillar of the case for reparations of African Americans. The practice of nearly a century of state-sanctioned apartheid in the United States. See, people don't know that apartheid and segregation is the same thing. The harms of Jim Crow's practice are extensive. Moreover, unlike U.S. slavery, there still are living direct victims. Particularly in the U.S. South, post-Reconstruction period gave way to a climate of terror that allowed whites to take blacks' lives and black-owned property with impunity. An Associated Press report documented 406 cases of black landowners who had 24,000 acres of farmland and timberland stolen from them in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Fact, not fiction. Dr. Ray Winbush has referred it to white caping as denoting the habits of night riders who confiscated land from vulnerable blacks during the era of Jim Crow. James Grossman in 1997 reported that 239 cases were recorded in Mississippi alone between 1890 and 1910. Further, perpetrators of the black property theft often colluded with local, state, and even federal government to defraud African Americans of their property. wholesale burning of courthouses, black churches, and homes were common ways of destroying evidence of black land ownership illegally obtained by white terrorists. The process of white destruction of black wealth reached an apex and in the literally annihilation of prosperous black communities in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, and in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. So any of you who watched the movie Rosewood, it was about a true story. Whites saw how the people in Rosewood were living, in the black community were living very well and living better. Their communities looked better than the whites in that area. And they got mad. So they went over and destroyed and started lynching and killing people and taking their land. Let me get back to the article. Moreover, lynching often may have conjoined the murders of blacks with property theft. Winbush speculated that lynching trails and trails of stolen black land containing that lynching victims frequently was black landowners. So a lot of lynchings that occurred, that was the reason why. As a matter of fact, the author Rudolph Ginsburg, he wrote a book called 100 Years of Lynching in America, where he calculated or just took newspaper articles from around the United States from 1860 to 1960, and it showed nothing but pure newspaper articles of lynchings and burnings of people, black people around this country for 100 years from that particular period. Today, while the black-white per capita income ratio is in the 50% range, the black-white wealth disparity is far wider. The highest estimate of the racial wealth ratio runs in the 15 to 25% range. Since the major source of wealth for most persons today is inheritance, the reduction of black wealth during the Jim Crow era has to have played a key role in producing contemporary racial wealth differentiations. American apartheid also subject 3 successive generations of African Americans to separate schools with inferior facilities and resources. Patterns of systemic residential segregation in both the North and the South restricted blacks' access to neighborhood amenities, quality housing, and hospital services. Differentially, sentencing and punishment of blacks extended from slavery time to the present has imposed immense costs on individual blacks and on communities of black persons. Employment discrimination further has constrained the opportunities of blacks to transform their skills and credentials into income comparable with whites while similar levels of attainment. Moreover, a recent study using the IMPUS census data by Doherty et al. 2001 showed that both labor market discrimination and imposing schooling deficiencies faced by blacks in the interval from 1880 to 1910 significantly weighed down the occupational attainment of their descendants in the 1980s and 1990s, a century later. Furthermore, current labor market discrimination continues to penalize black earners. Doherty et al. 2001, affording a further justification for reparations. Economics and reparations. Given the sustainability of reparations to compensate blacks for having been subject to slavery, Jim Crow practices, and ongoing discrimination, economics can provide useful insight in determining 1, the eligibility of reparations, 2, the type of reparations programs, 3, the long-term effects of reparations, 4, methods of financing reparations, and 5, the magnitude of reparations. The moral hazard principle alerts us to potential problems in establishing criteria for eligibility for recipients of African American reparations. Reparations would create a premium for blacks in America that previously did not exist. Thus, individuals who had not previously self-identified as black suddenly will have an incentive to declare their African ancestry. To mitigate this problem, we propose two criterion for eligibility. 1, individuals will have to provide reasonable documents that they had at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And 2, individuals would have to demonstrate that at least 10 years prior to the onset of the reparations program, they identified as black, African American, colored, Negro on their legal documents. Economics also leads us to contemplate a reparations program taking a number of forms, none mutually exclusive. One approach would be lump sum payments to eligible individual African Americans. A second approach would be to establish a trust fund to which eligible blacks would apply for grants for various asset building projects, including home ownership, additional education, or a startup fund for self-employment. A third option would be the provisions of vouchers that would be used for asset building purposes, including the purchase of financial assets. Thus, reparations could function as an avenue to undertake a racial redistribution of wealth akin to the mechanisms used in Malaysia to build corporate ownership among the native Malays. A fourth approach would be reparations in kind, guaranteed schooling beyond high school levels or medical insurance. A fifth approach would be the use of reparations to build entire new institutions to promote collective well-being in the black community. The vulnerable transfer problem, according to John Myers Keynes in 1929 and Harry G. Johnson, in 1955, and the international trade theory provide a warning that reparation and payments to blacks need not have the long-term effect of closing the racial income or wealth gap. In an extensive theoretical inquiry, Doherty and Frank state, we examine how different methods of reparation payments to African Americans would affect the black and non-black populations in the United States. We find that reparation payments that either mandate or provide incentives for blacks to spend on goods and services produced by non-blacks would raise the relative incomes of non-blacks. Without significant productivity, the capacity in place prior to the reparations, a lump sum payment actually could result in an absolute decline in black income. Thus, the structure of reparation programs is critical if it is to close the black-white economic gap in the United States. How are reparations to be financed? Public finance theory suggests that non-blacks could finance the transfer by paying additional tax and borrowers or lowering the spending. Alternatively, sometimes I get tired tongue. Alternatively, the United States could borrow on issuing government bonds to finance the reparations program. In general, African Americans should not bear the tax burden of financing their own reparation payments. Blacks pay local taxes, state and federal taxes, for more than 80 years while being disenfranchised in the U.S. South. A paradigmatic cause of taxation without representation. That sounds familiar. Was that the Boston Tea Party? Oh, 1776, huh? I'm saying 1455. We need to go back further. If, however, taxes are levied universally to finance reparations, guarantees must be put in place that the reparation payment net of the tax is substantial for black taxpayers. Furthermore, reparations income should be tax-free. Finally, I'm coming to a conclusion. Finally, the economic analysis could be mobilized to establish the magnitude of the reparations payment. Contributors to the Richard America's 1990 Wealth of Race used a variety of procedures to calculate the debt owed to blacks for slavery. Roger Ransom and Richard Sloth computed the difference between the market value of slaves net for food, shelter, and other consumption over the last 50 years for slavery, which led them to an estimated $3.4 billion by 1860. Larry Neal used a similar measure to unpaid wages for slaves between 1620 and 1840, compounded by 3% interest to the 1989 dollar to reach a figure of $1.4 trillion. John McKetty had an estimate that Africans' income foregone via slavery came to a present value estimated in 1983 at $3 to $5 trillion. Roger Vedder et al. Sought to establish the accumulated gains of wealth to white Southerners from ownership of enslaved blacks to arrive at a bill of $3.2 million as of 1859. In the current dollar, these procedures generally lend themselves to a present value estimated at a range of $5 to $10 trillion for debt for slavery. These numbers do not take into account the cost of Jim Crow or the cost of present discrimination. Estimated by David Schulten and George Chamber and Brendetta Chambers of the cost of labor market discrimination during the 40-year period from 1929 to 1969 alone run between $500 billion to $1.6 trillion, and in 1983 dollars. Suffice it to say, the damage to the collective well-being of black people have been erroneous, and correspondingly so is the appropriated bill. We know now here in the United States that there are over 10 cities here in the U.S. that are seeking reparations for African Americans, black people who are descendants of African slaves. And as we stated a couple of weeks ago, that Evanston, Illinois went ahead on and was the first city in the United States to incorporate reparations for descendants of Africans here in this country, where their city government is paying blacks $25,000 for a down payment on a home. That's something to start. That's a great idea. But we see what they did. Unlike Iowa, where we're here in the reddest of the red crayon state, our next door neighbors, Illinois, legalized cannabis, and because of the money that they're making off the sales of cannabis, the city of Evanston received their portion of the funds that came to their city, and they said, we're going to fix a problem here. We got a problem. A lot of folks don't have homes that happen to be of African descent, African American. So now they made a way that these people now can obtain homes, or if they have a house that needs to be refurbished, that $25,000 will go towards their house to refurbish the home that they already own. I know I've been listening to some of the replies from some of the people who send in some very horrible statements about what they think or what they feel, and without a true education of what's going on. You know, I'm not here just to speak my opinions. I'm here with evidence-based data. I'm up here with scientists, with doctors, with PhDs who's sitting up here studying the issue, and they're looking at how to approach the problem and how to solve the problem. This nation is divided as it's ever been. The wealth gap is just what it is. For every one white family, their wealth may be, on average in this country, $110,000 worth of wealth on the average. On the average black family in this country, $10,000 worth of wealth in their home. Why is that? I know present day whites had nothing to do with slavery 300 years ago. Yet, you're living off the privilege of what was done. And when you see a group of people who are at the bottom of the totem pole, the folks at the bottom of the totem pole want to get up. They want to see what the American dream is. Others come here from different portions of the world, and they find out what the American dream is. It's sad that the ancestors of African slaves are still pondering on what is the American dream, because so many only see an American nightmare. This is Negus, Rus and Imhotep. I'm coming with this information to enlighten, to open up your understanding. And if you take me for my word, if don't take me for my word, go look up yourself. Most of y'all got a computer, go to Google Scholar and type in subjects, and you'll find articles where you can read yourself, and you might, especially y'all the ones that sending these little bad emails, take your ass in the library and learn something. Then come back and let's talk like human beings. This is Negus Imhotep signing off. Enough knowledge. Respect.